This talk is absolutely jam-packed, so pay attention. I move fast. If you have questions, please just put your hand up. This is PHP 5.NEW, the best bits. My name is Davey Shafik. I am a community engineer at Engine Yard, which means I have the best job in the frickin' world because this is it. Engine Yard is a cloud application management platform. We take your PHP apps and scale them in the cloud. That's my pitch. I am the author of the Zend PHP 5 certification study guide. Version 3 is coming out real soon. PHP Master, PHP Anthology. Contributor to Zend Framework 1 and 2, PHP internals, kind of stuff. I'm also the original creator of PHAR, or PHP Archive. What that means is I wrote it in PHP and somebody way smarter wrote it in C and it got into PHP. I'm also the lead for PHP Women here in the United States. And I'm at Shafik on Twitter. PHP Women is doing a fundraiser selling these purple elephants, so if you would like one, come see me next door. I also want to take a second to mention Prompt. This is something Engine Yard does. It's a mental health awareness thing to help with mental health problems in technology. If you have any questions about that, come see me or prompt.engineyard.com. One more thing. I'm hard of hearing, so do please speak up. Normally I have hearing aids, but they're busted, so I'll have to come out if you have questions. And everyone forgets this, so don't feel bad. My slides run a little differently to most people. There's two things that I hate as an attendee. One is subtitles, because everything is on the slide as bullet points, and I can read faster than the guy speaking. It's like a Japanese dubbed movie. The other one is 16 pictures of cats with random words on them, and I can't get anything out of it after the fact. So I have a title slide like this, and then I'm going to skip a bullet point slide that has everything on it for you guys later. That's particularly important with this talk because there is more than double the amount of slides you're going to see. A whole bunch of other stuff I'm not going to cover today. Literally kind of everything from 5.3 onwards. I have a version indicator so you know what we're talking about. So be up there in the top right hand corner. If it covers multiple versions, then I have something that looks a bit like this, just so you kind of know where these things land. So we're going to start with the small stuff. PHP 5.3. Anyone not using 5.3 yet? Everyone using every feature of 5.3? Let's find out. So it was released June 30th of 2009. That is what, now 5.5 years old. It was 5 to 15% faster than 5.2. That was quite a big win. A number of extensions were either deprecated or enabled. So ereg, for example, which is the old POSIX regular expression, that's now deprecated, that's gone. SPL, which is phenomenal, is always enabled. And reflection, which is really cool, is also always enabled. They also added nowdoc, which is the equivalent of single quotes for heredoc, so you can't do variable interpolation. Added goto. Anyone using goto? Yeah, that's why they ripped it out of Hack. They also added this function here, stream context set default. The only reason that's on this slide is because that's my contribution to internals. So there you go. They added these magic methods, double underscore invoke, which means if you define that within a class and you instantiate it and you just do $object parentheses, then it will call that magic method. So it's kind of like a closure that is the whole class. What's interesting, that's kind of how closures work internally as well. They also added call static. So if you know double underscore call, well, if the method doesn't exist, it will call double underscore call with the name and the arguments. This is the equivalent, but for static methods. And then call was actually changed. So prior to this, if you tried to access protected and private methods, you would get the access warning. You can't access that. Instead, if double underscore call is defined, it will call that. And again, the performance increase was huge. 5.4 released a number of years later, March 1st, again 10 to 15% faster. Every release of PHP up to 5.6 has been phenomenally faster. And then 5.6 slowed down a little bit, and 7, sorry, not 6, right, 7 is going to be just phenomenal. So 5.4, they added an interface for session handler registration. So it used to be you would call session set save handler and pass in the individual callbacks. Now you can just either implement the interface or extend the default version of the class and just pass in that. Super easy. They added a PHP binary constant. I don't know why. Something that they did that got Drupal in trouble. Any Drupal is here? Okay. So 5.4, the Drupal test suite started failing spectacularly. And they complained to internals and said, you broke all our code. And the reason is that it started emitting a warning for array to string conversions, implicit array to string conversions, where you end up with that word array. And a whole bunch of the Drupal test suite was doing comparisons where it was actually comparing the two words array instead of comparing the contents of the word array. And that's why those tests were even passing. So the Drupal test suite was broken. They also added array type callbacks. So prior to 5.4, if you had, say, call user func array or something like that, you could pass in an array where the first argument was either an object or a class name, and the second argument was a method name. And if you passed in the object, it would be an instance method call. If you passed in the class name, it would be a static method call. What you can do now with 5.4 is you can create that array in a variable, and rather than have to pass it to call user func array or something, you just throw those parentheses right after it, just like it's a closure, and it'll call that method. It's really awesome. UTF-8 by default, which means that the car set header is UTF-8, might catch a few people out, but if you are running ISO 88591, you shouldn't run into an issue. They added a callable type hint. So we have class type hints or interface type hints. We have array, so you can hint for arrays. Now we have callbacks, which is any valid callback. That means a string that is a function name, an array like I just mentioned, a closure or a class with that double underscore call on it. Those will all pass that callable type hint. Not just a performance increase, it was a big memory boost as well, using less memory. Sorry, this is really creaky. Even better than 5.3. So 5.5 released June 20th, 2013, so that would have been last year. They deprecated the /e modifier in power-compatible regular expressions, preg. That was the eval modifier. So basically, you could actually eval code in your regular expressions, which is terribly insecure. So that's now deprecated. But even more importantly, ext MySQL. Anyone still using that? The original MySQL extension? That is now officially deprecated, not just community deprecated. So that's a huge win. They added boolval, which will coerce a variable into a boolean. It just kind of complements inval, floatval. They also added JSON serializable interface. So if you implement this interface, when you call JSON decode or JSON encode, it'll call the methods defined in the interface, and you can actually control what gets encoded into that JSON or decoded. One other thing they added, and I'm actually going to throw the slide up here so I can kind of explain this, the fully qualified class name constant. So it's not really a constant. So anytime you have a class, you can do : class, and that will give you the fully qualified namespace version of that class. And the reason it's not really a constant is it actually reuses the same keyword that you use to define the class. So class foo, right? So it's actually case insensitive. So it's not really a constant, but it's also not something anyone else can define because it is a keyword. I like to uppercase it just like it is a constant for clarity. MT now supports any valid expression. That's probably my favorite change in this release of the small stuff. And then finally, set error and exception handler. You can pass in null, and it will set it to the default. Before that, there was no way to get back to the default once you changed the error handler, which is really important. In, autoloaders, the Zend framework one, for example, will change the error handler so it doesn't blow up if the stuff doesn't exist. So 5.6. This is the latest release. This is stable. This is what everyone should be aiming for. Released August 28th of this year. Not much was added. This is the smallest PHP release that we've had in 5 years. And they added tpal, which is the exponent operator, so you can raise one number to the power of another. They added constant scalar expressions, which is a huge change and really, really cool, but also of limited use. And basically that allows you to do things like when you define a property in a class now, you can have math expressions. So long as everything is entirely static, as long as you're using either constants or scalars directly there, you can do any kind of, or most any kind of expressions. The other slides I mentioned have kind of examples of all of that. They added _debug info. It's another of these magic methods, and what that does is it intercepts var dump. So for example, if you have a file pointer, so you did an f open on something or a stream open, rather than dumping it and seeing resource 124, which is absolutely useless, you can actually do a stream stat and return a bunch more information in the var dump. And then they also added Gmp Operator Overloading. So Gmp is the integer big int math extension. Now, if you, first of all, they made it object-oriented. So it used to be done on resources. They changed it so everything is an object. So that's a backwards compatibility break if you are using it, but it should be minimal. But now you can do Gmp object plus Gmp object, and it will actually use the Gmp add function under the hood to add those things together. I'm hoping they bring that operator overloading to userland, but I'm not holding my breath. All right. So now we're actually going to get into some of the big changes and go through that. So namespaces is the first one. Before I do that, do I have any questions on anything I've covered so far? No? Okay. All right. So namespaces. Better code organization is kind of the goal, mainly to avoid naming collisions and allows you to alias out long names. So if you ever used PHAR back in the day, some of those class names were ridiculously long. This is a way to kind of help that. So namespaces must be defined at the top of the file. So whatever namespace you're in must be defined at the top of the file unless you're using curly brackets to enclose the code, which you would typically only do if you were doing multiple namespaces in a file, and I would highly recommend against it. So just go with namespaces at the top. The relative namespaces are supported. So when you're within a namespace, you can access stuff in lower namespaces without having to reference the parents that they're in. You don't need the fully qualified one. I still like to do fully qualified, but then I also don't use table aliases in MySQL. I like to be very explicit and verbose. You import and alias stuff with the use keyword, which is also the most used keyword now in PHP. It has so many uses. We'll cover all of those. And you can namespace not just classes, but functions and constants using the const keyword. And there's an improvement to that in 5.6, which is why it's got both versions. So this is what it looks like. So this is part of Zend framework. So namespace, Zend HTTP client adapter. Class socket implements HTTP adapter stream interface. So these two interfaces are within this namespace. So this is a relative path, and the full name of this class is Zend HTTP client adapter socket. Okay. To use that, there's 3 different ways. So if we're in the namespace of Zend and we use that here, so I'm doing an alias, so use Zend HTTP client adapter socket as HTTP client. That means anywhere in my code within this file, I can access that class as HTTP client with no sort of namespacing behind it. So 3 ways to instantiate that. Client equals new, this is relative, so we're already in the namespace Zend, so just new HTTP client adapter socket. New HTTP client, which is our alias, or the full name. And as I said, for me, I generally prefer to always use the full name anyways. With 5.6, they added the ability to import namespaced functions and constants. Prior to that, it was only classes. So outside of the namespace that you were in, that constant or function had to be either fully qualified or aliased, which was really janky, but at least allowed you to kind of shorten it down. It added 2 new keyword sequences, but not 2 new keywords. So basically, where we would use and then the namespace, now you do use function and the namespace function, or use const, and it will import those. And you can use commas to import multiples, regardless of whether you're doing classes or constants or functions. So this is what this looks like. So namespace foobar, this is that notation where you can have multiple namespaces. It's great for a slide, but again, don't recommend it. So const hello world equals hello world. Function strlen. So we're defining a function that exists within the global namespace, and to access that under the hood, we use this fully qualified slash because we're inside the namespace. By default, if we were to call strlen outside of this namespace without the fully qualified name, it will fall back to the global scope. However, if you do use function foobar strlen, of course, if you're not fully qualifying it at all, you're going to get the one that you're using. There is one caveat to this, which is this. Use function foobar non-existent. It doesn't exist, but if this was, say, array key exists, something like that, something that does exist in the global namespace, because you've tried to import it, it no longer falls through. Okay, so if you don't import the function, it will fall through to the global namespace. If you do import it and it does not exist, it will give you a fatal error function doesn't exist. Okay, so that's something you have to be careful of. Use const foobar hello world, so we're importing all that. So vardom strlen hello world, this is completely unambiguous now because we've done these multiple imports. strlen is going to be the one we defined up here. Hello world is our constants defined up there. And then as I said, because it doesn't fall through, var dump non-existent, it'll do a fatal error instead of falling through to the global scope. They're great for DSLs. This is probably the #1 reason I can see to use this. That's probably because I see a lot more Ruby than a lot of you guys, so I like DSLs, but yeah, there you go. All right, so any questions on namespaces? All right, so the other big feature in 5.3 and modified in 5.4 is closures. And they are probably my favorite feature. I also like JavaScript, so I see a lot of them. Basically, they're anonymous functions. You can define them on the fly, assign them to a variable, reuse them, pass them in as arguments, things like that. So here we have a very simple one. $A equals array with a bunch of numbers in it that are unsorted. Usort, which is the user sort function, so you can pass in a callback of any kind. In this case, we're doing a closure, so function A, B. If a double, this is a standard sort type algorithm thing, return -1 or 1, depending on whether it's larger or not, or 0. So we could have passed in a string that referenced a function name, or an array that referenced a method, or like we're doing here, a closure. If you want to inherit scope, because by default they do not, they are completely enclosed, they do not capture any enclosing scope, we reuse this use keyword and pass in variables from the outside scope. So here we're doing use who, so that means it pulls in from the scope where it's defined and now passes that into the function that's available to us as if it were an argument. So this will work, say hello, and it'll call this function. So in 5.4, they made a change that both made closures really, really awesome and also broke them completely, or rather broke the object model completely. So prior to 5.4, $this was not accessible within a closure. You had to pass it in as something else, which couldn't be called $this because that's a special variable. So if you've ever used lithium, for example, they would pass in $that, which was equal to $this to get the class that it was defined in. It was ridiculous. What they did is they made it possible now in 5.4 to get to $this, and it's early binding. So basically wherever the function is defined is where $this comes from, but you can change it. And that's where they broke the object model. So there's two functions, either closure : bind, which takes the closure itself and what you want to bind it to, or on the closure, because it is actually an object under the hood, there's a bind to, so very similar names. So bind is static, bind to is on the closure itself, and as I said, you can change what $this means. Now what's really, really important is that you can change the object that $this points to, but you can also change the scope from which it is accessed. And that's what breaks the object model. It is now possible for you to say, I want this closure to pretend that it is of this type foo, and it can now access all of the private and protected stuff inside of foo. Okay? So let's look at that. Class foo, public function get closure, return function, which just returns $this so we can inspect it. Class bar, public function _construct, $foo equals new foo, func equals foo get closure, so that returns our closure from up there. And if we run it and var dump it, in 5.3 it's just null. $this just basically doesn't exist. In 5.4 it's going to be foo because that's where it's defined, not where it is called. So it's not bar where it's called, it's not late static binding, it is early binding. Rebinding of $this, as I say, or how to break the object model, doesn't change the original closure. It creates a duplicate, so it creates a clone. That's really important. And as I say, $this can be any object, and the scope and what this is itself can be separate. There's only one use case that I can really think of for this, which is unit testing. It's great to be able to say, I'm unit testing a private or protected method. I honestly cannot think of a valid use that doesn't mean you wrote your code wrong in the first place. Okay. So we'll look at that. Class foo, public function get closure, return function echo hello world, call this world, right? So these are two things that do not exist inside of the foo class, which is what this will point to when we instantiate this closure. Class bar, and then we define our hello, and which is public. We also define a private function world, which echoes world, right? Now, this doesn't extend foo in any way. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the foo class. So $foo equals new foo, closure equals get closure, $bar equals new bar. So we're now creating an instance of bar. This thing is like wobbly. I'm sorry. There we go. New closure, because it creates a duplicate, it clones it, okay? Bind to $bar and call the closure. So now we're calling this up here. What's going to happen if I do this? All right, so if we do that, we're going to get a fatal error. So in our closure, we're still calling $foo world. Sorry, we're now calling $bar world, but we're still in the foo class context. All we changed was what $this pointed to. To go ahead and change the context as well, we add in another argument. So pass in the same one twice in this case to be accessing it also from the bar scope. What's interesting is $this can still be you, but you can call stuff on any instance of another type of object by changing that second argument. So for example, we could pass in foo for the first argument and then have an instance of bar within the closure. And because it thinks it is a bar, then it will also be able to access that private and protected stuff. So in this case, we do get hello world. Any questions on that before I move on? Okay. Traits. Traits are awesome. They're 5.4. This was the feature that I really wanted in 5.3 that didn't get in. This was the feature that I was like, I want this so bad. And I was so excited about it. And I've used them once, but they're still really cool. The use case that I have for them is Zend Framework 2 has a bunch of interfaces, and they have traits that can fulfill those interfaces with kind of defaults, and that's a great way to do that. PHP Storm, by the way, handles that beautifully. So horizontal reuse. So we don't have multiple inheritance in PHP because it's absolutely atrocious. This is a way for us to reuse stuff across multiple classes without having a broken object tree. So the way to think about traits is that they are compiler-assisted copy and paste. Almost literally. There's one case that's not the case, but if you want to know how a trait is going to react when you use it in a class, you can do the copy and paste by hand and it will have the exact same behavior except for one case that we'll get to. So, number of new keywords, trait and instead of. And it also reuses use and as. Okay, so again, that use keyword being used. You can inherit you can implement multiple traits, and you use the as and instead of to resolve conflicts by hand. So PHP says, I'm not going to try to figure this out. That's your job. You're the developer. You should know what you're doing. You can define methods, abstract methods, and properties within a trait. Now, abstract methods are really cool. That allows you to specify things that the implementing class has to also have for that trait to be usable. So you can say, I need a function that does X, Y, Z, but I don't want to define it in my trait because it's going to be concrete to the class that's inheriting. So you define it as an abstract method, and if you don't define it, just like when you extend an abstract class or an interface, it will go ahead and complain that it's not there. So that allows you to set requirements for the trait. And they can be namespaced, and they're identified just like functions and classes and constants. So this is what a trait might look like. So namespace dsutil, ds being my initials, trait secure debug info, public function _debug info, $info equals array this. So basically I cast the object that we are in to an array so that we can easily iterate over it. For each info as key value pair, if key 0, the first letter starts with a underscore, then we're saying it's private, we don't want it to be exposed. We go ahead and unset it from our info array, and then we would, we would return that, and var dump would not output any sensitive data, right? That's the idea behind this. So we use it very simply. We have a my class under my namespace, use util secure debug info. Now that function exists within that class as if I'd written it there or pasted it there by hand. Okay? And again, as I mentioned, you can use commas to have multiple uses. Actually, you can do both. You can have multiple use lines or you can use commas. That's optional. Inheritance in traits is kind of interesting. It's not like classes. You don't extend. So to inherit a trait, you just use it within another trait. So trait 1, public function 1, trait 2, public function 2, trait 3 just uses both of those, and now trait 3 comprises of both function 1, function 2, and the one that's defined within it, function 3. Inheritance and traits. So if you are inheriting a class that uses a trait, so in this case, class numbers uses the one trait. So that gets a method from the one trait called one, right? And we're defining 2 and 3 ourselves. If we then extend that and we do a use 2, we inherit 1 from the first one. We pull in 2 from the trait. Now it overrides the 2 from the first class. Okay, so the trait, because it's being used in this one, overrides as if it were copy and pasted right here. Okay, exactly as you would with inheritance. And because we're defining a public function 1, it overrides the 1 that came from the trait. Okay, so the trait overrides the function from the inherited one defined here, just exactly the same as if it was in the trait or not, will override from the other one. This one, even more numbers, extends more numbers, use 3. So bear in mind, 3 is comprised of 1 and 2 already. I know this is a little hard to follow, but 3, 1, which was brought in from the 1 trait in the first place, overrides the 1 here, because this is the last one in our inheritance chain. 3, 2 overrides 2 that came from the 2 trait. 3, 3 overrides the inherited 3 from the first one. And then we define it here, and it overrides the trait. Okay. So that's actually the place where the copy and paste falls down. And this is why it's not literally copy and paste. If you copied and pasted the trait of 3 into here, you'd have 2 3 functions, because you've got the 1 defined here and the 1 in the trait, and that would be a duplicate method name error. With traits, there's kind of this little layer where you can override stuff in the trait where you're using it. Okay, so that's the one glitch in the matrix. As I mentioned, you can do requirements. So in this case, public function debug info, I've decided that I want to have this get data, so I'm not going to do it manually. I want the trait that is implementing it to go, the class that's implementing it to define that method. So I define that as an abstract public function get data. Anywhere we use this trait, it's going to complain if you don't have a get data method. Conflict resolution. So, as I mentioned, we use the as and instead of keywords to do conflict resolution. It's always by hand. PHP will never try to do it for you. So if you ever see this method, trait method, whatever the name is, has not been applied because there are collisions with other trait methods on class. So what that means is you're using 2 different traits that have methods of the same name, and it doesn't know what to do. So use ds-util secure debug info, which defines my _debug info, and maybe I've got one in my framework as well, so I pull in the debug helper. So what I do here is I say, okay, I want my secure one. So I really like the one in the framework, but I've implemented my own secure one on top of that. So I do ds-util secure debug info. This is the one that we want, instead of the one that's in the debug helper from my framework. Okay, so you say, I want this one instead of that one, and it'll just discard the other one. The other thing that you can do is aliases. So in our use, again, these curly brackets, by the way, which maintains all of this, we're still pulling in our debug info instead of my framework debug helper. But maybe we still want the framework one. So maybe we kind of quasi-inherit. So we go, we know we're using this with the framework. We still want the one in the framework. So what we can do is we can actually use an abstract method to say, say it was bringing in the get data, for example, that get data method. So we can use as to alias. So my framework debug helper debug info, so the one that did conflict that we've just said we don't want anymore, we can pull in as something else and still have access to it. You have to understand aliasing is not renaming. So if you're not doing an instead of, both names will exist. Okay? You can also change visibility. So basically between, well, 5.4, they completely made it possible to break the object model. Inside of your use statement, my trait, my method is protected, so it doesn't matter what it was in the trait, it will come in as protected. And you can also bundle that with aliases, so my trait, my other method as private, and then the alias name, okay? So bear in mind that by doing that, you're potentially breaking the contract that people expect you to set from the trait itself, okay? So that creates spaghetti code. Again, it's one of those code smells. If you're doing this, you're probably writing it in the wrong way. Detecting traits. So they added array dereferencing, which means that you can call a function and access the keys of the array immediately after, but it throws away the array, which I think is a terrible waste of memory, and your function is probably doing the wrong thing. But this is one use case for it, but it's also something you shouldn't do. So You can't use instance of to detect if something is a trait. It's not an interface or a class in the hierarchy. So instance of does not detect the use of a trait. So what we do is there's a class uses function, which will basically give you an array of keys and values being the same thing. So this implements both the 1 and 2 traits. So we have a key 1 with a value 1 and a key 2 of a value 2. Okay. So we can do if class uses whatever the name of the trait, then it's true, right? But you should never be relying on the existence of a trait for functionality. You should not be writing logic about whether or not you're using traits. Okay. So as I say, you can use this, but I highly recommend against it. Any questions on traits? Okay. Finally, and this is not the end of the talk. This was added in 5.5, so if anyone's used pretty much any other language that has exceptions, they have try, catch, and finally. And basically, code within the finally block is always executed, regardless of whether or not an exception was thrown. And it also means, just like the deconstruct, the destruct method on an object, it will get called when the page exits, right? So it'll always close that stuff down. Stuff in finally stuff will also execute that way. So when PHP winds down the stack, all the stuff in finally clauses gets called. So this is actually really great for things like closing database connections or things like that. So maybe you had a database connection and that's fine, and then you created a query and that blew up. But you don't really care either way. You still want to close that database connection or a file handle or something like that because you want to flush to disk. Like, there's a whole bunch of use cases for it. But basically it looks like this. So try whatever, catch some exception. So in this case it's all of the exceptions, and handle it. And regardless of whatever happened, do whatever happens in the finally block. Now, the catch is now optional. So you can do try finally and expect your exception to be handled later up in the stack, and it'll still unroll this finally stuff at the end of the application, okay? Any questions on that before I move on to this? All right, so this is, for me, the most important feature that was added in PHP in the last decade, simple password hashing. So it makes password hashing super easy. The defaults are the most secure option, okay? If you don't try to fuck with it, excuse my language, you can't get it wrong. So the purpose is to make passwords super easy, secure passwords, safe for everybody. It uses bcrypt currently. That may change. Salting is automatic, but it can be supplied. The hash itself identifies the algorithm. So when you look at the hash, you can tell not just what algorithm was used, but also the cost factor that was applied. So you don't need that information when you're verifying passwords. That's really important. And you can also pass in an array with both the salt, as I mentioned, and the cost. So by default, PHP has a cost of 10. You're going to want to change that based on your hardware. If you have an 8XL on Amazon, then you're going to have maybe a cost of 12 versus a cost of 3 or something on a micro. So depending on your hardware, you're going to tweak that, and you should be tweaking that. Do not rely on the default. Do some tests. You want this stuff to be kind of slow. So this is what it looks like. $hash equals password hash, whatever password we're passing in. That's my actual password. Don't copy that. And password default, which defines the algorithm. When I first saw this, I was like, why the heck do they have this? It's the same as bcrypt. This is probably the coolest function for me of the password extension, which is that you can actually have rolling security updates. Password default may and probably will change at some point to a better, more secure algorithm, either because bcrypt they've created hardware that makes it super easy to brute force, or they found a vulnerability in it and it's useless, right? So by using password default, when you update your PHP will automatically use a more secure algorithm. And because the hash that results from that tells you which algorithm was used, password verify will just automatically verify against whatever hashing algorithm was used. Okay. So to verify, we do password verify, passing, testing, which is the user supplied string now. They're doing a login, and then hash, which is the original hash in our database, and it will return true or false, right? So as I mentioned, you can pass in options. I recommend you do with the cost. Cost of 20 is probably kind of high, but hey. Salt, bcrypt uses 22 characters, which is exactly 22 characters, and I love this slide for that. So you pass those in as the third argument, and that'll affect the hash. It also provides two helper functions which allow you to, one is just informational, but the other one allows you to actually make those rolling updates. So password needs rehash. You pass in the same set of arguments that you pass into password hash, and it'll tell you, does the password or the hash that you have, does it meet those requirements? So if you change your cost, then it will say, oh, this one's using the old cost. Yes, it needs rehashing, please do that. If password default changes to a different algorithm, it'll go, yes, it needs rehashing. So what that means is, when your user logs in, you can verify them using password verify, then call this function, and if it returns true, you go ahead and recrypt the password that they've just passed in to log in and restore it. Okay, so you can have this rolling update as users log in of making sure that your users have the most secure hashing applied to their password as possible. And then password get info just returns basically all the info that you can get out of the hash looking at it. I go backwards, yes. Any questions on password hash? Well, can you yell? Do you have a mic? No, not that much. You don't know how deaf I am. This is why I hate being up on stages.
Who's asking?
I did a talk in Amsterdam, and I was like up and down and up and down. I'm like, got my Fitbit on at least. I'm getting my steps in.
Do you have recommendations on how to do that cost calculation based on your hardware and environment?
Yes, test. So run a benchmark. You want it to be, so like an MD5 is like picoseconds, like it's so fast. You want it to probably be at least a tenth of a second at least. If you can stretch it to a second, which would be kind of crazy, but your users will thank you in the long run. But yeah, I would say like 100 milliseconds or something, as opposed to, microseconds. Anything else? Yes. Whoa.
Can the rehash be called just knowing the hash, or does it have to be called using like the user entered password?
You need to have the user's password to rehash it. Yeah, because you can't encrypt it. Yeah, it needs to be at login when you've already got their their password. So, all right, we're almost up to 5.6. So this is. I wish I could just like jump up on the front of the stage, but it's not going to happen. Maybe in another 100 pounds. So generators added in 5.5. This was the big feature for me, just like traits in 5.4. Generators are super cool. Again, I don't use them very much, but if you do need them, that's great. So it introduces another new keyword. So we've got a lot of those over these few versions, which is yield. And so generators allow you to do things like iterators without a whole bunch of boilerplate code. And they're actually, the yield keyword actually allows you to hand state back and forth between the calling scope and the generator itself. So functions and methods are automatically turned into generators if they have the yield keyword somewhere within them. And what that means is that when you call the function, instead of actually calling the code within a function, it will actually return an instance of the generator class, which is an internal class, which you can then iterate over either manually or using something like a for each. So 5.3, when they added closures, they added the closure class, which was an implementation detail, which meant don't rely on it because it may change. 5.4, they made that concrete by adding those bind and bind to methods. This is very similar with the generator class. It is an implementation detail. Don't rely on it. This set of slides is insane, just so you know. It took me hours to write it, and if you have questions, please stop me. Okay, so function hello generator, $who is the argument. We use our wonderful array dereferencing to do $greeting, hand me a random 1, 0, 3, so it'll give me a random greeting, yield $greeting, which passes control back to our for each, which we'll get to in a second. On the next iteration, we output a space, and on the third iteration, we'll output whatever the name was with a/n. Okay, let me break that down for you. Generator equals hello generator passing in world. No code within your function is executed at that point, which is absolutely bizarre. What actually happens is this generator variable is now filled with a generator instance, which represents this function. We then for each over it, and this value variable in the for each will get whatever is yielded within that function. And we'll iterate 3 times because we have 3 yields. Okay? So the first time through, we yield the greeting. So echo $value will yield one of those random greetings. The next iteration round will yield that space, so we output a space. And the third time, as I said, we get this UC first, whatever the who was, and that'll be output. So basically, we get random greeting world, right? Fantastic. Another look at a different generator here. So you can also put yield inside of things like a while loop or a for each loop. And again, the control will be passed back to the outside scope, and the yield, the enclosing loop will not just continue to run until we jump back in to that function through iteration. Okay, so for I equals 0, I less than 5, I plus plus, yield $i. This is not hard, right? If we were to for each over this generator, then the first iteration through we would get 0, the second iteration through we would get 1 and 5, 2 and 10, 3 and 15, and 4 and 20, okay? That for does not run on its own. The for each that you pass that generator into is jumping in and out of that for loop at the yield and pushing it forward, okay? So what does that really look like? So function gen, echo 1, yield 2, echo 3, yield 4, echo 5. I like numbers. Generator equals gen. So we're going to start on this line right here, this green circle. Creates our generator object, okay, and assigns it to generator. If we were to look inside of that for each loop and how it runs, the first thing that it does is it calls rewind. Okay, this is how we iterate over arrays. There's a whole bunch of functions, rewind, next, valid, etc. These are the same functions, but they're actually just methods on this generator class. So the first thing that happens is we rewind, which jumps us into our generator, okay? So it runs the first bit of code, and it runs until it hits the very first yield. Then jumps back out. So at this point, we haven't yielded the 2. We've only run until the backside of that yield. We haven't gone past the yield yet. We then call if generator valid, and then we go into that if, because it is, because we have more to do in that generator. And then we call current, which says get me whatever the current value is. And that jumps, as you saw, back into the iterator, into the generator, and that's where yield 2 happens. So the echo will get 2 as its argument on the right-hand side there. We then automatically jump back out to the echo, so it can finish off that expression. Echo 2. We hit next, which is basically saying we're now moving on to the next part of the iterations. That's the end of the loop. So the next happens at the end of the loop. That's really important to understand. It doesn't happen at the start of the loop. It happens at the end of the loop, which jumps us back into our generator, right at the point we left it. So at the end of that expression. We then continue running until we get to the backside of the next yield. So we echo 3. That's why I hate these slides. We echo 3, and then we pause at the backside of that yield. And that is one walk through a single for each iteration. The next iteration, rewind doesn't happen, but the valid happens, and valid again will return true until we're at the end of this function. There's 3 ways to get out of a generator. I'll get to that. So either the generator no longer has any values, or we call next, carry on. So generators will turn for 3 reasons. A return, and note that you cannot pass back a value. So straight return, if you put anything after that, it'll be a parse error. An exception is thrown and not caught within the generator. And finally, there are no more yields. So if you do a while loop with a yield inside it, and you do while true, for example, that generator will never end. Okay? But it also doesn't run and go off on a hair because you're not iterating through it. So it's not sitting there, in the background running this while loop. It just stops execution until you want to iterate over it. So another thing that you can do with generators is send data into them. They're not just pulling data out. And this is what's known as a coroutine. So you can send absolutely any data into a generator. And basically, the yield is used as an expression. So it's just a different way to use that yield keyword rather than a statement. So you're not saying like a return. You're not saying return stuff. You're saying I'm pulling something in, so I'm getting input. This also advances the generator. So every time you pass in something using send, it's the same as doing an iteration. And you can send and receive at the same time. So it's not concurrent, but the same one expression can, the yield can both pull in data that's being sent in by the send, and the result of that send can be something that the yield is passing back out. Okay, so that's kind of powerful, but I haven't seen many use cases for it. The only one I've really seen is the one that's in the RFC, which is this one right here. So a logger, function logger, take in the file name, that's what you want to open. File handle equals fopen. While true, write whatever is yielded so whatever's passed in, plus a new line, to the file handle, right? Logger equals logger. We want to open a file called log. Send foo, send bar. Okay, so each one of these will jump in at the yield keyword right there and write it to the log file. I tried to extend this just a little bit. That's the one straight out of the RFC, but I wanted to be a little better. I don't know about you, but a log without timestamps is pretty useless. I'm like, okay, I'll just add some timestamps, right? This should be easy. And I didn't get it working the first 4 or 5 times I did it, and I was convinced I'd found the bug, so I hopped in the RFC channel and said, guys, I've got a bug. And they explained it to me. I went, that's dumb. And so I wrote about it when I updated the Zend cert guide. I thought I was convinced I found the same bug. Like it doesn't make sense to me. And they're like, yeah, it kind of doesn't make sense, but it does. So we're going to walk through that. I don't think there's any reasonable use case for this functionality. I'll throw that in there again. So here's what I did. Function gen, so logger, I equals 0 because I decided that I wanted to know how many log lines I've written by every time I call the logger. While true, file put contents because I like streams. I hate the fopen, fclose stuff. I like streams. I like to do this file append. My date, which is this little function down here that just returns my formatted date, concatenated with a space, whatever's passed in, and pass back out the number of lines that we've logged to this point, concatenate a new line and append it to the file, right? That's pretty simple. That makes sense to me. So call the generator, send in the first call, sleep for 3 seconds, send in the second call. Right? So I should have 2 log lines that are 3 seconds apart. That makes a lot of sense to me. If I read this, that would make sense to me. This is what was in my log file. You can see when I did this. February 4, 2013, 3:39 and 51 seconds. The first call happened. 3:59 and 51 seconds. The second call also happened, but there's a sleep 3 between those 2 calls. What the heck? That makes no sense to me whatsoever. So this is why I thought I'd found a bug. Here's what happens. On the first iteration, here's our code. We create our generator. We call the send, and we jump into that, which pushes us up into our generator. And we run into our while true loop, start our expression to create our string, which jumps down to the myDate function, jump right back up, yield, and add that extra space, add the PHP EOL, so add our new line, complete the writing to the log file. And this is where it gets tricky. We then go back around. Okay? So we'd go right up to the top of the while, back into our expression, call myDate again, back up to the yield. And that is the point that we pause. Come back down here. Okay? So because it runs the yield that you want, and it'll run until it finds the next yield and stop before it. So it goes back into the loop and carries on. But because that yield happens after the myDate, it means we basically called it twice in very rapid succession, and because we're doing seconds, it's much slower, it's much faster than that. That's why we got the same date. So the next time that we run and we do a send, it looks like this. So we've just finished the first one. We sleep for 3 seconds. That's where our sleep happens. So we called myDate twice, and then we sleep. Call the send. We jump right back in at that yield. So after the myDate, and basically complete that loop and do the exact same thing again. Okay? So back into myDate, back up, back to the yield, and then we come out again. What that means is if you log a third line, it gets the timestamp that I would have expected to be on the second line, and of course it itself is not 3 seconds later as I would expect. It's 3 seconds behind. So that confuses the hell out of me, but that's the way it works. If you were to shift that myDate to the right-hand side of the yield, you wouldn't have this bug, but then your log lines would look terrible. Just how it is. The other thing that you can do, you can send data in using send. You can also send in exceptions. So basically, where you have that yield keyword is where the exception is thrown from. And the actual yielded value. So with a send, you can send data back out. With an exception being thrown in, you can't. Okay, so it's just exception being thrown in. What it looks like: function gen, echo foo, trial while true, yield bat, catch. So because that yield is inside a try catch block, if we pass in an exception, it'll get caught by, there should be a slash there, it'll get caught by this catch and the generator will continue, okay? If we didn't have a catch in there, we can actually explode the generator and say we're done at this point. So it's a way to actually control flow by sending in exceptions. So what that looks like, gen equals gen, var dump gen current, which echoes foo and dumps the string the string bat, which is yielded right there. We then do a throw, new exception, so that will echo, that will basically jump back up at that yield, go straight into this exception. So it'll echo out exception and whatever the name of the exception is, and then it'll do the bar here because that's outside of the try-catch block. Okay, but the while true, that yield bat, that bat just kind of disappears. Okay, that's it. Oh, that's just one more thing. At that point, because we broke out of the while loop, because we went into this catch block, that actually ends the generator. Okay, so that's one way of breaking out of one of those while loops. So valid will return false, or for each will stop iterating, whatever you're doing. Any questions on generators? All right, 5.6, how much time? We have 9 minutes. We're almost done. 5.6 added 2 awesome new features. The first one is Variadics, which looks like this, triple dot dollar variable. That is not an ellipsis, it is 3 periods. Make sure your editor doesn't, like in OS X, it'll replace 3 periods with an ellipsis. Make sure that doesn't happen in your editor. So triple dot variable, it's used as an argument. So variadic means that your function can accept any number of arguments. Now this has always been the case in PHP as far back as I can remember. You can just pass in any number of arguments and PHP won't complain. Okay? But to get those arguments, you have to use func numargs to see how many there are and func getargs. And func getargs would return not only the extra arguments, it will return all of your arguments. So if you have 2 defined arguments, you have to strip those out, and then you have the rest of them. With a variadic, you just define a property that's triple dot dollar variable, and that will just contain all of the extras. And you don't need to call any functions, you don't have to strip anything out. That's all it's for. Okay? And it's also self-documenting at that point, because you know that your code says, I expect an unlimited number of arguments. Okay? It also has 2 extra features that you don't get with the old passing any number of arguments in. You can type hint it, so you can say everything that is passed in after this argument must be of this type, and you can also use references. Okay? Must be the last argument. No ifs, ands, or buts. This is what it looks like. Function fn, some sort of required parameter, some sort of optional parameter, triple dot params. So you never used to be able to put anything after an optional parameter that had no default. You can with Variadics. Variadics are 0 or 1. Okay. Var dump, required parameter, optional parameter, params. Okay. Call it with the 1 required argument. We get 1 null and an empty array, which will evaluate to false. Pass in the required one and an optional one, we still get an empty array. And then as we start adding in more arguments, that last parameter is basically an array of those arguments. Okay? As I mentioned, you can do references. Now this is straight out of the RFC and is some really clever but quite complicated code, in my opinion. So class MySQL implements DB, public function prepare, $query, and then this referenced variadic, so ampersand params. Statement equals PDO prepare, so we're doing a prepared query, whatever query is passed in, and then we go ahead and iterate using references. We make sure we maintain that reference all the way through. So we iterate with references, and we start binding parameters to that prepared statement. And then down here, we call it, so db prepare, insert into users, name, email, age, values. I hate the question mark syntax, but it's out of the RFC. Name, email, and age, so those are our reference variables. Then we do for each, all of our users to insert. So we're going to assume that it's an array of names, emails, and ages. And because we now have the ability to do list in for each, that's another new feature that I think was added in 5.4, maybe 5.5. So for each users to insert as list $name, email, age, that will assign those 3 array keys to those variables, execute. So what happened there? Because we're using references up here, we're passing these variables in by reference. Every time we assign those variables in the list, those now are bound to those parameters automatically when we do the execute. Okay? As I mentioned, you can also... You can also do type hints, so basically just like you would with any other argument, prefix with whatever, and it's exactly the same as doing for each, all of the stuff in this array, is it an instance of or type of this thing. So in this case, callable, we know automatically that everything that came in is a callback, and we can just call it without verifying that it is. The other feature that was added is argument unpack, also known as splat. And it uses the exact same syntax, but in a slightly different way, so triple dot dollar variable. So this is now used as an argument. So you're passing it in, it's not a parameter. Okay? So when you call the function, you can now do triple dot dollar variable. And what that will do is it will take something that looks like an array, so either an array or an array iterate or something like that, and it will take the individual values in that and pass them in as individual arguments. Okay? So it's the opposite of Variadics. No more call use a func array, which is really slow, whereas this is not. It's also valid for any argument list. So constructors, built-in functions, userland functions, doesn't matter. You can use it anywhere. It's great. You can also use it multiple times, but there's a caveat to that as well. It must be at the end of the argument list. When the RC originally went up, you could actually put it anywhere in the argument list, and they changed that because you wouldn't know necessarily what was being passed in, and then your last defined arguments, you didn't know what the hell they were going to contain. So, function test, I'm going to use a variadic here because it's nice for the slide, triple.args, var dump args. I can then pass in individual arguments by hand, or I can use this triple dot splat syntax to unpack an array, or something that looks like an array, and we have the exact same thing. Okay, so this is great for like passing in, if you have configuration variables that you want to pass in as individual arguments for, say, your database connection, right? You no longer need to write them out. You can just use this unpack operator. This is what got taken out. So it used to be that you could put them on the left-hand side, but that no longer came out with 5.6. That got RC1 or 2, that got taken out. All right, any questions before I move on to the last tiny little bit? All right, so you asked a question on password security, and that's what this last little thing is about. As I said, this is probably, for me, the most important feature that was added in PHP by default in ever. So there's two goals of password security. One is to make dictionary attacks difficult, and the other one is to make brute force attacks difficult. Those are the two primary attacks you're going to run into. A strong salt will make your dictionary attacks much more difficult. You can't use rainbow tables to look stuff up because it's going to be completely random, because your password salted is different from the same password salted with something else. A rainbow table basically just says, oh, we have a hash of ABC, and we know that that correlates to whatever because we've got that already listed somewhere. It's just a lookup. Okay? A high cost, which is the other argument, makes it take a long time. So as I said, 1/10 of a second. Which basically it doesn't make it impossible to brute force, it just makes it not cost effective. There's only two ways you can overcome that. More hardware or more specialized hardware. Or take time, and time is money, right? The cost is what makes both SHA-1s and MD5 a terrible option. So both of those, and like all the SHA families and the MD5 families, the purpose is for validation, not for hashing passwords. And because of that, they're fast. So if you ever like download an ISO of a Linux distro and you run MD5 something on it, that's, you know, a 4.2 gigabyte file, and it takes maybe a minute, right? Imagine how fast that is on an 8-character string, right? Fast is the enemy of password security, and both of those families of algorithms are meant to be fast. Additionally, MD5 also suffers from collisions, but I've recently learned from the guy who wrote the password hash thing that doesn't actually apply to passwords because the length of the password needs to be like 2 to the 65 characters. Okay, so ignore that bit. Here's some numbers for you. MD5 you can generate on, so this was done on a four small servers with like 12 graphics cards, consumer graphics cards. The cost of the setup was like $1,200, right? 180 billion MD5 hashes per second, regardless of salt. Okay, it's an insane number. SHA-1, which is what most people move to from MD5, 63 billion a second. SHA-512, 364,000 a second. That's getting a little better, but when you compare that to bcrypt at 71,000 per second with a cost of 3, default in PHP is 10. Okay, 71,000 per second is just 253.5 million% slower. That number's like this freaking long, right? And I did some benchmarks, like if you like take MD5s and do it like 5 times, it's still twice as fast as like SHA 512, which still makes it like 99.99997% faster than bcrypt. Okay, bcrypt is the be-all, end-all right now of password security. Now there are a couple of others, PBKDF12, or I think it's called, or 2, was also added to PHP, but not for password info in 5.5. But it's just not quite as good. There's also scrypt, which is more about memory consumption. So bcrypt is CPU slow. scrypt is memory. It's basically a memory hog on purpose. Okay, so it's slightly different purposes. If you have a machine that's constrained by memory, then maybe use scrypt. If you have a machine that's constrained by CPU, like most of them are, then bcrypt is a better option. This was all taken from this PDF down here. I highly recommend that you take a look at it. So that's it. Feedback, questions. I'm on Joined In. Please go rate me. It's super important. That's how this talk gets any better, and I will be giving it again. Just go ahead and scan that if you want to get the Joined In link. At dshafik on Twitter. I love Twitter followers. Davey at engineer.com. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them either later or via email. And the slides will be up at davyshafik.com/slides. Thank you very much.